Hello everyone, welcome back to History Surfer. This is Dr. A, and I am doing a film on the principles of design for my art appreciation class. So what are the principles of design? Let's begin there. Let's look at some of the definitions associated with that. The first one is when you design the visual elements, and if you're in my class, you would have had that lecture before this one, and also it's included on my YouTube channel, so you can see it here if you haven't seen them. You have to know what the visual elements are, and then you understand why you have to have design principles. Because design principles are a broader idea. I put both composition and design here because I wanted you to understand that one is really specifically for the 2D arts, and one is for all of the design is all of the visual arts. I think of this as being comparable to, think of if you're a builder and all the things that you have to work with. That's like the nails, it's like, what am I talking about? Nails, boards, all that kind of stuff. Those are the visual elements. In order to understand what you're going to do with all that stuff, you then have to have the blueprints. That's the design principles. How to put them together. So what are some of the things that you have to think about when you're putting your visual elements together? Well, let's talk about one of the major issues that every artist has to overcome, and that is unity and variety. You have to have both of these things. They both have to work together. They both have to enhance your piece. You want unity because it gives consistency to your work, and you also want variety because it creates interest. If you just have the same thing repeated over and over and over again, you're just creating essentially a pattern. So we really want these things to enhance each other. Unity and variety, both super important. Another issue you have to worry about is balance, because believe it or not, there are two types, symmetrical and asymmetrical. When we think of, at least I do, I think of balance. I think of symmetry as being when you make something that both sides are exactly the same, and asymmetry being the two sides are opposite. Now, why would I want to have asymmetry versus symmetry? Well, one of the major reasons, is because that symmetry can tend to be somewhat boring visually. When both sides are exactly the same, like on this structure here, one wing of the White House, this is exactly the same on both sides. There's nothing that deviates. Look at even the two fireplaces you can see are exactly the same. Something this symmetrical can be visually static, but because it's architecture, it's okay. We want things to feel static and stable when we're looking at buildings, and one of the ways to achieve that is in using symmetrical balance. Note too, when you have something that's symmetrically balanced, the center is going to be very strong, and that's very typical of a symmetrically balanced piece, versus if you have something that's asymmetrical, like this image. Both sides are different. It's definitely, this person was thinking about balance and focal point. And so he has this she has this very small shape here versus this very large dark shape here. Large dark shapes can be overpowering. So just because it's asymmetrical doesn't mean I don't have to think about other things. I still have to think about that. How strong is this? And so usually when you have something big and dark like this, you balance it with lots of smaller, lighter things, and it creates it so that one side of the image doesn't feel visually heavier than the other. And I know that's a weird concept for some people, but there is visual weight in things. For instance, colors. The color red is very visually heavy. It will draw your viewer's eye, and so you have to think of how you're going to keep their eye in other parts of the image, and one of the ways you do that is to have something like this big dark shape here. pulling the viewer into the piece instead of just focusing on this. It's almost a red triangle. Other things that you have to have when you're designing your piece. You have to have a focal point. You may have a main focal point and a secondary focal point and even a tertiary focal point, but you do have to have focal points to create interest. And those things are sometimes not clear, and that's not good. You must make sure everything is subordinate to the spot you want to emphasize, that it supports it. For instance, this very big, strong circular shape is definitely the focal point, and everything else in here pushes our eye towards that. It's supporting it. I can do something that's more representational, and you can see that. Look at the white horse, which is obviously the focal point, and how all of these lines, they're lances, but they're lines, we call them, they're falling down towards that. Even a triangle here pointing you here. And the artist clearly says to us, look here. This is a well-designed piece, and we are totally clear. Directional forces, like a series of lines, help our eyes to follow these paths and look where the artist wants us to look. There's a couple of different things they're using here, but certainly the way that those lines made by the subject matter of the guns is pointing helps us to really hone in on that particular spot. You can use repetition, rhythm, and patterns in your design and create interest, create unity, create visual things our eyes are drawn to. So when I repeat something like this is a series of square shapes, I'm unifying this. So repetition, a very strong force in unifying your piece of art. Andy Warhol knew that. He did it all the time. He repeated shapes, he repeated colors, he repeated symbols, all speaking to the repetition of modern culture. But still, it's a good way to keep us focused in on the piece, and we also notice the original. And I think that's the point of this. It's the only one in yellow. Look at the background I'm talking about. And it's the only original Campbell's soup can. The original stands out. Everything else is really just a repeat. I mean, that does speak to modern society. Patterns were used historically to create interest and also to draw us into pieces. Look at the floor here. Jan Vermeer, the artist here, wanted you to feel as if you were walking past an open door and you looked over into this room and you saw this stuff happening and you just wanted to know what was going on, and the pattern of the floor just draws you in. It creates a flow that you almost feel when you look at this. Finally, we talk about scale and proportion when we talk about the design principles. Scale is the size of an object or an artwork relative to another object or artwork. So in other words, it's an external comparison. And proportion is the relationship between a work's individual parts. So internal versus external. So for instance, I'm trying to look on my desk and see if I can use something here. I'm going to put this cup here. All right, let me move my camera down so you can well, the lighting's not great. But anyway, if I compare this ruler to this ruler, I'm doing an internal proportional evaluation. If I compare this ruler to this pencil that's outside of the cup, then I'm using an external, so that's a scale issue. When we think of that, we really do realize how much three-dimensional art forms focus on that, and people like Klaus Oldenburg was quite aware of skewing scale, making things that are actually, quite small and for his purposes, and comparing to something very large, and then skewing it by making the small thing really big too, you're really making people look at this object, what they wouldn't regularly look at. This is a playing piece from a game, and it's not that big. But when I make it big, you are drawn to it. It definitely catches your eye. Badminton was the game, and I remember these. You hold them in your hand. But here we see it compared to a very large building, so we look at it. And locally, in West Palm Beach, we have an Oldenburg, and this is a typewriter eraser, and it's set in front of the Norton Museum of Art. If any of you are watching this who are not local, this is our big art museum. And when you compare something that would traditionally be a small handheld thing, and you put it in front of a building, you make it this big, people look. And that's the purpose. So scale can also be referred to as hierarchic scale as well as hierarchic proportion. These types of devices were in use for a very long time. As you can see, I'm looking at the interior of an Egyptian tomb. And we have this very large man here and this very small one. This is the king. He's big, not because he was a giant, but because the hierarchic proportion of this piece tells us this is the king. The bigger they are, the more important they are. So in other words, here in layman's terms, the bigger it is, the more important it is. That's all you have to know. Artists use these things in the past because people couldn't read and write. And so how would you know which one was the king? You knew because of the use of hierarchic proportion here. Here's one that's three-dimensional. Well, that other one, this is called relief, so it would be considered 3D too. But here's another one. The large one is the king. The small one is the least important of this grouping of figures. You can do it in painting as well. It's not just a 3D thing. Here we know who's the most important person. It's Mary. She's the largest compared to the angels and these church elders. And so this is a device that does really help direct where the viewer is supposed to look, and so they understand what's happening here, even if they're not artists. Proportion, that interior comparison, is super important. Usually you want things to be in proportion to each other when they're in the same design. Well, sometimes it doesn't work. For instance, the Pietà, that weird word there, is the theme of Mary holding Christ in her lap after he's taken from the cross. Well, it's awkward. Look at how the artist tried to brace Christ's body here, so it didn't look like it was sliding off of her lap. It's not a good solution to the problem. And artists always struggled with this. If you make them in proportion to each other, a 5'8" woman holding a 6' man is going to be awkward looking. And so artists came up with some crazy solutions. Look at this one. Make Christ really small and Mary's head abnormally large. I've always thought this was so weird. It's a piece from the Middle Ages. It's German, and it is a very strange piece. Look at how many ribs here. But this doesn't work. What works in this case is Michelangelo's solution. He made Mary bigger. So he skewed the proportion. Just as Oldenburg skews scale, Michelangelo realized at this point, I have to skew the proportion here. Mary, she stood up. She'd be 8 feet tall, and she can hold Christ quite easily. He's a 6-foot figure. They've done measurements on the Pietà. So I hope that that's clear now for all of you and that you understand how important design is. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and peace out. I'll talk to you later. Bye.